Now, we know that Helldivers 2 has been getting bashed pretty heavily lately by everyone due to the balance changes, the direction of the game, the way Arrowhead has been handling things. All of this has split the community one way or another, but I really don't want to focus on the balancing itself, because enough people have already talked about that. It's a never-ending issue, okay? Let's just leave it at that. What I want to talk about today is the ideology behind it, the actual fantasy that Arrowhead seems to think Helldivers is supposed to be, and why I think there's a major disconnect between the vision and what Helldivers 2 actually became. And before people misunderstand me here, this is not about bashing Arrowhead or saying that the game is terrible. This is more of an observation about the setting itself and why there seems to be such a divide between developers and the players. Because on a fundamental level, I don't think Arrowhead understands what Helldivers actually are, at least not narratively, which is a little bit ironic given the fact they made them, but this type of stuff happens from time to time. Developers seem to view Helldivers as grunts, disposable infantry, thrown into a meat grinder for Super Earth. But the problem is that Helldivers 2 itself does not portray them that way, and hasn't from the very beginning. In reality, Helldivers are something very different. They are elite shock troops, highly expendable shock troops, yes, but still elite. And that distinction is important because disposable does not automatically mean grunt, and that is where the entire disconnect begins. We start with a single phrase from the box art of Helldivers 2. Spread democracy with overpowered weapons. And when you look at that statement, the game should theoretically be about overwhelming force projection, massive firepower, orbital bombardment, mechs, airstrikes, absurd weaponry, humanity throwing everything it has at the enemy and then some in the most destructive way possible that even the kitchen sink is a nuke. But then you look at Arrowhead's balancing philosophy and the way that they describe the Helldivers themselves, and it feels strangely at odds with that statement. But why is this? To understand that, we need to listen to something Johan Pilestead said regarding the inspiration behind Helldivers 2.
So Helldivers 2 was originally envisioned, this is the original hypothesis, is that Helldivers is a co-op action shooter where you play as the evil guys in the galaxy, so your Stormtroopers or whatever it might be in pop culture. And how would you fare as one of the extras in the background? Like, you know, when they try to breach the cell block in Star Wars, and the first Stormtrooper through the door, he of course gets shot in the chest by Han Solo. And that's the question of, would you do better climbing into that room trying to capture the bad guys, that are trying to take over your lovely Death Star? And then also, would you be able to survive in a galactic war without plot armor to protect you? It's really the question that we ask with Helldivers. Our design pillars, which is that we put the fantasy first. And what we mean by fantasy first is that if we say that you're supposed to be a mobile infantry grunt in the Starship Troopers, we need to ensure that it feels like being the mobile infantry grunt in Starship Troopers. So it means that we have constraints set already. Can a Starship Troopers mobile infantry jump 2 meters up into the air? No, they cannot. Not in the movies at least, and not without assistance. In that case, we'd have to adhere to that. Ensure that we keep the fantasy safe throughout the entire journey and not compromise on it when things get tough.
Now, do you see the issue? Because the examples being used here are not actually grunts, or at least not the way Arrowhead seems to think they are. But let's be fair, what is a grunt? By definition, a grunt is a low-ranking infantry soldier, the backbone of the military. They patrol, occupy territory, build defenses, perform hard labor, and fight wars through mass deployment and attrition. They're ordinary soldiers, replaceable because they are ordinary. And this is where I think Arrowhead made a critical mistake in how they view the Helldivers, because a shock trooper and a grunt are not the same thing. A grunt is replaceable because they are just one soldier among thousands. A shock trooper is replaceable because the mission matters more than the individual. Those are two different military philosophies, even if both are considered expendable. Let's take a few examples here, such as the Stormtrooper, because they're probably the clearest example of this. In Star Wars, Stormtroopers are not grunts. They are the elite corps of shock infantry designed to rapidly overwhelm resistance, maintain Imperial control, and spearhead assaults into hostile territory. Their equipment alone already reflects this. The armor, while cheaply made, is designed around survivability and mobility. Depending on continuity, the armor disperses pierces or absorbs the blaster impacts enough to incapacitate rather than to outright kill the wearer, while also protecting against environmental hazards and even bladed weapons to a degree. Their weapons follow the same philosophy. The E11. The E11 is lightweight, compact, reliable, and capable of sustained fire while still being practical in close quarters. Everything about the Stormtrooper is designed around aggressive force projection and operational flexibility. And the best example of how Stormtroopers actually behave is right at the beginning of Episode 4 during the boarding of the tentative V4. The rebels initially hold the line, and even kill a stormtrooper immediately after the breach, but then the pressure starts building. The stormtroopers continuously advance through the corridor, forcing the rebels backwards room by room until the ship is completely taken within minutes. That's not how grunts operate. That is professional assault infantry conducting a rapid boarding action, and I think this is one of the biggest issues that Arrowhead's comparison. They focus heavily on the expendable nature of the stormtroopers, while ignoring the reality that the Empire still treats them like elite infantry assets designed for spear tip operations. Are they expendable? Yes, but they're still highly capable soldiers just for critical missions. And I'm going to say this, yes, I understand the whole meme about them missing. Let's take consideration that after the first Death Star was destroyed, the stormtroopers had to be flooded with recruits who didn't finish their training, which caused their accuracy to go down. Now, let's move on to another one, such as Mobile Infantry from Starship Troopers, because this was a little bit more complicated. At the beginning, the Mobile Infantry are actually grunts. Poorly armored, barely trained cannon fodder thrown directly into the meat grinder against the arachnids. The Federation treats them as endlessly replaceable, and casualty rates reflect that. But the important detail is that they don't remain that way. As the war continued, the Federation realized that mass infantry assaults were unsustainable. The Mobile Infantry began evolving. They introduced Marauder suits, improved deployment systems, heavier support platforms, and more advanced combat technology because of the realities of the war had forced them to adapt. The Mobile Infantry gradually shifted away from being simply expendable infantry into a highly militarized force capable of surviving prolonged galactic warfare. And that is important, because Helldivers follow a very similar trajectory. The more dangerous the enemies become, the more the Helldivers rely on overwhelming force multiplication. Tanks, mechs, orbital support, specialized weaponry, destroyers operating as dedicated support craft. All of this pushes the Helldivers further away from ordinary infantry and closer to becoming a mechanized elite shop corps. Again, expendable does not mean weak. So then, that begs the question, what do actual grunts look like? If we want real examples of the grunt fantasy Arrowhead seems to be aiming for, the better examples would have been the Imperial Army Troopers from Star Wars or the Imperial Guard from War Before Decay, especially formations like the Cadian Shock Troops and the Death Corps of Krieg. They're actually grunts. Mass infantry forces meant to hold territory through sheer numbers and attrition. Human beings reduced to statistics on a logistics sheet. Entire regiments thrown into meat grunts and replaced almost immediately after catastrophic losses. That is a grunt army. But ironically enough, Helldivers 2 already has that. You see, the real grunts of Helldivers 2 are the SEAF troopers. And once you realize that, the entire idea of Helldivers being grunts starts to fall apart almost immediately. The SEAF are the planetary garrisons. They hold territory, maintain infrastructure, defend occupied worlds, and continue fighting long after the Helldivers have already extracted. They're the ones building artillery emplacements, anti-air batteries, bunkers, LiDAR stations, defensive lines. They're equipped with standardized gear, basic rifles, and minimal support. No destroyers in orbit, no orbital barrages, no specialized stratagem deployment systems. They're just soldiers. Meanwhile, Helldivers are being dropped directly behind enemy lines in squads of 4 with enough firepower to cripple entire enemy operations. Factory striders, battle titans, command infrastructure, strategic production centers. Helldivers are routinely deployed against targets that would normally require entire battalions to engage directly. That is not grunt work. That is special operations. units. Highly expendable special operations, but still special operations. No military gives ordinary infantry independent naval support or authorization to level entire combat zones with orbital weaponry, and that is where the disconnect really starts to show itself. Arrowhead keeps trying to preserve this fantasy that the Helldivers are ordinary disposable infantry, being spurred on by propaganda, but the setting itself constantly portrays them as an elite rapid sponsor force trusted with the most strategically important missions in the war effort. And I think that's where a lot of the friction surrounding Helldivers 2 actually comes from. Players did not fall in love with Helldivers because it made them feel weak, helpless, or ordinary. They fell in love with being poor, expendable lunatics dropping behind enemy lines with absurd amounts of firepower and just enough survivability to somehow complete impossible missions. That is the fantasy Helldivers 2 accidentally perfected, not the Grunt fantasy, the shock trooper fantasy. Still no plot armor, still expendable, but still epic. And the more Arrowhead tries to force the game back towards an idea of Helldivers being basic infantry, the more tension there seems to be between the developers wanting the game to feel like and what the players actually connected with. Because, whether intentionally or not, Helldivers 2 has already shown players what Helldivers really are, and Arrowhead just doesn't seem to realize it just yet, if they ever will.